All right, class, welcome to chapter 10 of Frederick Douglass. This is a very long chapter. I will be breaking it up into probably about 3 different readings. We left off at the end of chapter 9 with Frederick Douglass being sent to a man named Edward Covey, and Covey is a slave breaker. Okay. I left Master Thomas's house and went to live with Mr. Covey on the 1st of January, 1833. I was now, for the first time in my life, a field hand. In my new employment, I found myself even more awkward than a country boy appeared to be in a large city. I had been at my new home but 1 week before Mr. Covey gave me a very severe whipping, cutting my back, causing the blood to run, and raising ridges on my flesh as large as my little finger. The details of this affair are as follows. Mr. Covey sent me very early in the morning of one of our coldest days in the month of January to the woods to get a load of wood. He gave me a team of unbroken oxen. Unbroken means they're not trained. Okay, they're not broken in. He told me which was the in-hand ox and which the off-hand one. I don't know exactly what that means. Maybe which one is kind of the leader and which one's the follower. He then tied the end of a long rope around the horns of the in-hand ox and gave me the other end of it and told me if the ox started to run that I must hold on upon the rope. I had never driven oxen before, and of course I was very awkward. I, however, succeeded in getting to the edge of the woods with little difficulty, but I had got a very few rods into the woods when the oxen took fright and started full tilt, carrying the cart against the trees and over stumps in the most frightful manner. I expected every moment that my brains would be dashed out against the trees. After running thus for a considerable distance, they finally upset the cart, dashing it with great force against a tree, and threw themselves into a dense thicket. How I escaped death, I do not know. There I was, entirely alone, in a thick wood, in a place new to me. My cart was upset and shattered, my oxen were entangled among the young trees, and there was none to help me. After a long spell of effort, I succeeded in getting my cart righted, my oxen disentangled, and again yoked to the cart. I now proceeded with my team to the place where I had, the day before, been chopping wood, unloaded my cart pretty heavily, thinking in this way to tame my oxen. I then proceeded on my way home. I had now consumed 1/2 of the day. I got out of the woods safely and now felt out of danger. I stopped my oxen to open the woods gate, and just as I did so, before I could get hold of my ox rope, the oxen again started, rushed through the gate, catching it between the wheel and the body of the cart, tearing it to pieces, and coming within a few inches of crushing me against the gatepost. Thus twice in one short day I escaped death by the merest chance. On my return, I told Mr. Covey what had happened and how it happened. He ordered me to return to the woods again immediately. I did so, and he followed on after me. Just as I got into the woods, he came up and told me to stop my cart, and that he would teach me how to trifle away my time and break gates. He then went to a large gum tree and with his axe cut 3 large switches, and after trimming them up neatly with his pocket knife, he ordered me to take off my clothes. So a switch would be like a whip, making a whip out of a tree branch. I made him no answer, but stood with my clothes on. He repeated his order. I still made him no answer, nor did I move to strip myself. So this is really significant because Douglass is resisting. He's not following an order. And to disobey as a slave, you can be put to death for that. Upon this, he rushed at me with the fierceness of a tiger, tore off my clothes, and lashed me till he had worn out his switches, cutting me so savagely as to leave the marks visible for a long time after. This whipping was the first of a number just like it, and for similar offenses. I lived with Mr. Covey for 1 year. During the first 6 months of that year, scarce a week passed without his whipping me. I was seldom free from a sore back. My awkwardness was almost always his excuse for whipping me. We were worked fully up to the point of endurance. Long before day we were up, our horses fed, and by the first approach of day we were off to the field with our hoes and plowing teams. Mr. Covey gave us enough to eat, but scarce time to eat it. We were often less than 5 minutes taking our meals. We were often in the field from the first approach of day till its last lingering ray had left us, and at saving fodder time, midnight often caught us in the field binding blades. So sometimes there in the field as late as midnight working, and then they have to be up again before the sun rises the next day. Covey would be out with us. The way he used to stand it was this: he would spend the most of his afternoons in bed. He would then come out fresh in the evening, ready to urge us on with his words, example, and frequently with his whip. Mr. Covey was one of the few slaveholders who could and did work with his hands. He was a hard-working man. He knew by himself just what a man or a boy could do. There was no deceiving him. His work went on in his absence almost as well as in his presence, and he had the faculty of making us feel that he was ever present with us. This he did by surprising us. He rarely approached the spot where we were at work openly, if he could do it secretly. He always aimed at taking us by surprise. Such was his cunning, his sneakiness, that we used to call him, among ourselves, the snake. When we were at work in the cornfield, he would sometimes crawl on his hands and knees to avoid detection, and all at once he would rise nearly in our midst and scream out, "Ha ha, come, dash on," this being his mode of attack. It was never safe to stop a single minute. His comings were like a thief in the night. He appeared to us as being ever at hand. He was under every tree, behind every stump, in every bush, and at every window on the plantation. He would sometimes mount his horse, as if bound to St. Michael's, a distance of 7 miles, and in half an hour afterwards you would see him coiled up in the corner of the wood fence, watching every motion of the slaves. He would, for this purpose, leave his horse tied up in the woods. Again, he would sometimes walk up to us and give us orders as though he was upon the point of starting on a long journey, turn his back upon us, and make as though he was going to the house to get ready. And before he would get halfway there, he would turn short and crawl into a fence corner or behind some tree, and there watch us till the going down of the sun. So Mr. Covey, he's called the Snake. He's famous for always watching his slaves, but never openly. He does it secretly. So he'll crawl up in the grain or the corn or whatever it is they're growing and hide, and then pop up right next to them. He'll pretend to be leaving and going on a journey, but as soon as he gets out of sight, he'll circle back. So the slaves are always watching their back, wondering if he's watching them. Mr. Covey's forte, his strong point, consisted in his power to deceive. His life was devoted to planning and perpetrating the grossest deceptions. Gross there doesn't mean like ew, gross, disgusting, but like horrible and bad. Everything he possessed in the shape of learning or religion he made conform to his disposition to deceive. He seemed to think himself equal to deceiving the Almighty, so he thinks tricking people and lying to them. He would make a short prayer in the morning and a long prayer at night, and strange as it may seem, few men would at times appear more devotional than he. The exercises of his family devotions were always commenced with singing, and so devotions here would be religion, church. And as he was a very poor singer himself, the duty of raising the hymn generally came upon me. He would read his hymns and nod at me to begin. I would at times do so, at others I would not. My non-compliance would almost always produce much confusion. To show himself independent of me, he would start to stagger through with his hymn in the most discordant manner. In this state of mind, he prayed with more than ordinary spirit. Poor man, such was his disposition and success at deceiving, I do verily believe that he sometimes deceived himself into the solemn belief that he was a sincere worshiper of the Most High God, and this too at a time when he may be said to have been guilty of compelling his woman slave to commit the sin of adultery. So Douglass here is asked to sing sometimes, so Douglass must have a good voice. Makes sense. We know that he's a great speaker later in life. But he says, again, this reference to religion and to being a hypocrite, right? To putting on a display of being a great Christian person, but then treating your slaves horribly. And here, Covey, we're gonna find out how he has this slave commit adultery. Adultery would be cheating on your husband or wife, right? Having an affair, sometimes we call it. The facts in the case are these. Mr. Covey was a poor man. He was just beginning in life, and he was only able to buy one slave. And shocking as it is, in fact, he bought her, as he said, for a breeder. Remember, the child slaves, their slavery or freedom status depends on the mother. This woman was named Caroline. Mr. Covey brought her from Mr. Thomas Lowe, about 6 miles from St. Michael's. She was a large, able-bodied woman, about 20 years old. She had already given birth to one child, which proved her to be just what he wanted. After buying her, he hired a married man of Mr. Samuel Harrison to live with him 1 year, and him he used to fasten up with her every night. The result was that at the end of the year, the miserable woman gave birth to twins. So Mr. Covey's plan, he has a woman, and then he has a man, and this is a married man, and he hires him. I don't know if this man is free or if he's a slave, but every night this man sleeps with her until she's pregnant, and she gives birth to twins. So now Mr. Covey, his one slave purchase, has given him now 3 slaves with the 2 that were just born. At this result, Mr. Covey seemed to be highly pleased, both with the man and the wretched woman. She was his joy, and that of his wife, that nothing they could do for Caroline during her confinement was too good or too hard to be done. The children were regarded as being quite an addition to his wealth. If at any one time of my life more than another, I was made to drink the bitterest dregs of slavery, that time was during the first 6 months of my stay with Mr. Covey. Okay, the dregs of something is when you're drinking, and usually it would be something in a really big container, like say a keg of beer, okay? Something large. And the dregs are the very bottom that's left, okay? Or if you're drinking a cup, the tiny little bit at the bottom would be the dregs. Doesn't taste as good. The it's just left over. It's from temperature now. It's not that flavorful anymore. Okay, so when he says the dregs of slavery, he's saying the worst part of it. We were worked in all weathers. It was never too hot or too cold. It could never rain, blow, hail, or snow too hard for us to work in the field. Work, work, work was scarcely more the order of the day than of the night. The longest days were too short for him, and the shortest nights too long for him. I was somewhat unmanageable when I first went there, but a few months of this discipline tamed me. Mr. Covey succeeded in breaking me. I was broken in body, soul, and spirit. My natural elasticity was crushed, my intellect languished, the disposition to read departed, and the cheerful spark that lingered about my eye died. The dark night of slavery closed in upon me, and behold, a man was transformed into a brute. Remember, a brute's an animal. This is an all-time low for Frederick Douglass. He's saying that Covey turned him into an animal. And remember, the whole point of him going to Mr. Covey was to be broken, body, mind, and spirit. And Douglass says that is what happened. Sunday was my only leisure time. Leisure time is time for yourself to do what you want. I spent this in a sort of beast-like stupor. A stupor is a dazed state. Between sleep and wake, under some large tree. At times I would rise up, a flash of energetic freedom would dart through my soul, accompanied with a faint beam of hope that flickered for a moment and then vanished. I sank down again, mourning over my wretched condition. I was sometimes prompted to take my life and that of Covey, but was prevented by a combination of hope and fear. My sufferings on this plantation seem now like a dream rather than a stern reality. So he's considering here killing himself and killing Covey, but he never quite does. There's that little bit of hope that someday things will change, but also the fear of what might happen. Our house stood within a few rods of the Chesapeake Bay, whose broad bosom was ever white with sails from every quarter of the habitable globe. Okay, so this is a really important part in the book. So he's on the Chesapeake Bay, and he talks about there being boats, sailboats from every corner of the habitable globe. So here in the Chesapeake Bay are boats from all over the world coming to drop off goods and then pick up goods and go on to the next port. So he's standing here looking out. These beautiful vessels, these beautiful boats robed in purest white, so delightful to the eye of free men, were to me so many shrouded ghosts to terrify and torment me with thoughts of my wretched condition. I have often in the deep stillness of a summer Sabbath stood all alone upon the lofty banks of that noble bay, and traced with saddened heart and tearful eye the countless number of sails moving off to the mighty ocean. The sight of these always affected me powerfully. My thoughts would compel utterance, and there, with no audience but the Almighty, that would be God, I would pour out my soul's complaint in my rude way, with an apostrophe to the moving multitude of ships. So he's standing here on the shore, there's no one around, and so here he can pour out his soul. Okay, when he says an apostrophe, that's look in the next paragraph, see all of those capital letter O's. Okay? An apostrophe is a literary technique where you're in such a depressed and desperate state that you start talking to things that aren't human, things that aren't really there, things that can't talk back. Okay, and it just shows, and you're revealing your thoughts and your emotions. So he's going to start talking to these ships. You are loosed from your moorings. Moorings is when the boat's tied up. Okay, they're free. Frederick Douglass is not free. Okay, he's very much still moored up or still in fetters, handcuffs, shackles, chains. You are loosed from your moorings and are free. I am fast in my chains and am a slave. You move merrily before the gentle gale, and I sadly before the bloody whip. You are freedom's swift-winged angels that fly around the world. I am confined in bands of iron. Oh, that I were free. Oh, that I were one of your gallant decks and under your protecting wing. Alas, between me and you, the turbid waters roll. Go on, go on. Oh, that I could also go. Could I but swim, if I could fly. Oh, why was I born a man of whom to make a brute? The glad ship is gone. She hides in the dim distance. I am left in the hottest hell of unending slavery. Oh, God, save me. God, deliver me. Let me be free. Is there any God? Why am I a slave? I will run away. I will not stand it. Get caught or get clear. I will try it. I had as well die with ague as the fever. I have only one life to lose. I had as well be killed running as die standing. So he's looking at these boats. The boats are free. You can go wherever they want. He's not. He wants to be like one of those boats. He wants to be on one of those boats. So now he's making the decision. Come hell or high water, I'm out of here. Better to die trying to escape than to live in this awful life, this awful existence. Only think of it, 100 miles straight north and I am free. Try it? Yes. God helping me, I will. It cannot be that I shall live and die a slave. I will take to the water. This very bay shall yet bear me into freedom. The steamboat steered in a northeast course from North Point. I will do the same, and when I get to the head of the bay, I will turn my canoe adrift and walk straight through Delaware into Pennsylvania. When I get there, I shall not be required to have a pass. I can travel without being disturbed. Let but the first opportunity offer, and come what will, I am off. Meanwhile, I will try to bear up under the yoke. I am not the only slave in the world. Why should I fret? I can bear as much as any of them. Besides, I am but a boy, and all boys are bound to someone. It may be that my misery and slavery will only increase my happiness when I get free. There is a better day coming. Thus I used to think, and thus I used to speak to myself, goaded almost to madness at one moment, and at the next reconciling myself to my wretched lot. So he's decided he's going to be free as soon as he can, but that little paragraph there, he's still bouncing back and forth. One moment full of hope that he'll escape, the other moment just miserable because of the life he has to live. I have already intimated that my condition was much worse during the first 6 months of my stay at Mr. Covey's than in the last 6. The circumstances leading to the change in Mr. Covey's course toward me form an epoch in my humble history. You have seen how a man was made a slave. You shall see how a slave was made a man. So an epoch is like another word for era. It's a defined period of time. And he says, you're going to see how I was made a man. On one of the hottest days of the month of August, 1833, Bill Smith, William Hughes, and a slave named Eli and myself were engaged in fanning wheat. Hughes was clearing the fanned wheat from before the fan, Eli was turning, Smith was feeding, and I was carrying wheat to the fan. The work was simple, requiring strength rather than intellect. Yet, to one entirely unused to such work, it came very hard. About 3 o'clock that day, I broke down. My strength failed me. I was seized with a violent aching of the head, attended with extreme dizziness. I trembled in every limb. So it sounds like he's having some sort of heat stroke here. Excuse me. Finding what was coming, I nerved myself up, feeling it would never do to stop work. I stood as long as I could stagger to the hopper with grain. When I could stand no longer, I fell and felt as if held down by an immense weight. The fan, of course, stopped. Everyone had his own work to do, and no one could do the work of the other and have his own go on at the same time. Mr. Covey was at the house, about 100 yards from the treading yard where we were fanning. On hearing the fan stop, he left immediately and came to the spot where we were. He hastily inquired what the matter was. Bill answered that I was sick and there was no one to bring wheat to the fan. I had by this time crawled away under the side of the post and rail fence by which the yard was enclosed, hoping to find relief by getting out of the sun. He then asked where I was. He was told by one of the hands. He came to the spot, and after looking at me a while, asked me what was the matter. I told him as well as I could, for I scarcely had strength to speak. He then gave me a savage kick in the side and told me to get up. I tried to do so, but fell back in the attempt. He gave me another kick and again told me to rise. I again tried and succeeded in gaining my feet, but stooping to get the tub with which I was feeding the fan, I again staggered and fell. While down in this situation, Mr. Covey took up the hickory slat with which Hughes had been striking off the half-bushel measure and gave me a heavy blow upon the head, making a large wound, and the blood ran freely. And with this again, he told me to get up. I made no effort to comply, having now made up my mind to let him do his worst. In a short time after receiving this blow, my head grew better. Mr. Covey had now left me to my fate. At this moment, I resolved for the first time to go to my master and enter a complaint and ask his protection. Remember, Mr. Covey's not his master. Thomas Old is his master, but he's been rented out for a year to be broken. So Douglass is going to go back home and enter a complaint, say Covey is unfair, he's cruel, he's beating me. In order to do this, I must that afternoon walk 7 miles. And this, under the circumstances, was truly a severe undertaking. I was exceedingly feeble or weak, made so as much by the kicks and blows which I received as by the severe fit of sickness to which I had been subjected. I, however, watched my chance. While Covey was looking in an opposite direction and started for St. Michael's, I succeeded in getting a considerable distance on my way to the woods when Covey discovered me and called after me to come back, threatening what he would do if I did not come. I disregarded both his calls and his threats and made my way to the woods as fast as my weak state would allow, and thinking I might be overhauled by him if I kept the road, I walked through the woods, keeping far enough from the road to avoid detection and near enough to prevent losing my way. I had not gone far before my little strength again failed me. I could go no farther. I fell down and lay for a considerable time. The blood was yet oozing from the wound on my head. For a time I thought I should bleed to death, and think now that I should have done so, but that the blood so matted my hair as to stop the wound. After lying there about 3/4 of an hour, I nerved myself up again and started on my way, through bogs and briars, barefooted and bareheaded, tearing my feet sometimes at nearly every step, and after a journey of about 7 miles, occupying some 5 hours to perform it, I arrived at my master's door. I then presented an appearance enough to affect any but a heart of iron. From the crown of my head to my feet, I was covered in blood. My hair was all clotted with dust and blood. My shirt was stiff with blood. My legs and feet were torn in sundry places with briars and thorns, and were also covered with blood. I suppose I looked like a man who had escaped a den of wild beasts and barely escaped them. In this state, I appeared before my master, humbly entreating him to interpose his authority for my protection. I told him all the circumstances as well as I could, and it seemed, as I spoke, at times to affect him. He would then walk the floor and seek to justify Covey by saying he expected I deserved it. He asked me what I wanted. I told him to let me get a new home. That as sure as I lived with Mr. Covey again, I should live with but to die with him, that Covey would surely kill me. He was in a fair way for it. Master Thomas ridiculed the idea that there was any danger of Mr. Covey's killing me, and said that he knew Mr. Covey, that he was a good man, and that he could not think of taking me from him, that, should he do so, he would lose the whole year's wages, that I belonged to Mr. Covey for 1 year, and that I must go back to him, come what might, and that I must not trouble him any more with these stories, or that he would himself get hold of me. After threatening me thus, he gave me a very large dose of salt, telling me that I might remain at St. Michael's that night, it being quite late, but that I must be back to Mr. Covey's early in the morning, and that if I did not, he would get a hold of me, which meant he would whip me. So didn't really do much to reach out to his master, but he does get to stay the night before he has to go back to Covey. I remained all night, and according to his orders, I started off to Covey's in the morning, Saturday morning, wearied in body and broken in spirit. I got no supper that night or breakfast that morning. I reached Covey's about 9 o'clock, and just as I was getting over the fence that divided Mrs. Kemp's field from ours, out ran Covey with his cowskin to give me another whipping. Before he could reach me, I succeeded in getting to the cornfield, and as the corn was very high, it afforded me the means of hiding. He seemed very angry and searched for me a long time. My behavior was altogether unaccountable. He finally gave up the chase, thinking, I suppose, that I must come home for something to eat. He would give himself no further trouble in looking for me. I spent that day mostly in the woods, having the alternative before me, to go home and be whipped to death, or stay in the woods and be starved to death. That night I fell in with Sandy Jenkins, a slave with whom I was somewhat acquainted. Sandy had a free wife who lived about 4 miles from Mr. Covey's, and it being Saturday, he was on his way to see her. I told him my circumstances, and he very kindly invited me to go home with him. I went home with him and talked this whole matter over, and got his advice as to what course it was best for me to pursue. I found Sandy an old adviser. She told me with great solemnity I must go back to Covey, but that before I went, I must go with him into another part of the woods, where there was a certain root, which, if I would take some of it with me, carrying it always on my right side, would render it impossible for Mr. Covey or any other white man to whip me. So we see some superstition here, that if you take this root and carry it in your pocket, then you'll be safe from whipping. He said he had carried it for years, and since he had done so, he had never received a blow and never expected to while he carried it. I at first rejected the idea that the simple carrying of a root in my pocket would have any such effect as he had said, and was not displeased to take it. But Sandy impressed the necessity of much earnestness. Was not disposed to take it. So he doesn't think it's going to work. But Sandy impressed the necessity with much earnestness or seriousness, telling me it could do no harm if it did no good. So to please him, I at length took the root, and according to his direction, carried it upon my right side. This was Sunday morning. I immediately started for home, and upon entering the yard gate, out came Mr. Covey on his way to meeting. So on the way to meeting, that would be his Sunday church meeting. He spoke to me very kindly, asked me to drive the pigs from a lot nearby, and passed on towards the church. Now, this singular conduct of Mr. Covey really made me begin to think that there was something in the root which Sandy had given me, and had it been any other day than Sunday, I could have attributed the conduct to no other cause than the influence of that root. And as it was, I was half inclined to think the root to be something more than I had first taken it to be. All went well till Monday morning. On this morning, the virtue of the root was finally tested. Long before daylight, I was called to go and rub, curry, and feed the horses. I obeyed and was glad to obey, but whilst thus engaged, whilst in the act of throwing down some blades from the loft, Mr. Covey entered the stable with a long rope, and just as I was half out of the loft, he caught hold of my legs and was about tying me. As soon as I found what he was up to, I gave a sudden spring, and as I did so, he holding to my legs, I was brought sprawling to the stable floor. Mr. Covey seemed now to think he had me and could do what he pleased, but at this moment, from whence came the spirit I don't know, I resolved to fight, and suiting my action to the resolution, I seized Covey hard by the throat, and as I did so, I rose. He held on to me, and I to him. This is huge. This is a turning point in the book. Frederick Douglass Earlier, we saw him just not listening to an order, just ignoring it, which is really bad. Now he's fighting back. He's got Cubby by the throat. Okay, he's holding him, and they're both standing up together. My resistance was so entirely unexpected that Covey seemed taken all aback. He trembled like a leaf. This gave me assurance, and I held him uneasy, causing the blood to run where I touched him with the ends of my fingers. Mr. Covey soon called out to Hughes for help. Hughes came, and while Covey held me, attempted to tie my right hand. While he was in the act of doing so, I watched my chance and gave him a heavy kick close under the ribs. This kick fairly sickened Hughes so that he left me in the hands of Mr. Covey. Also, this kick had the effect of not only weakening Hughes, but Covey also. When he saw Hughes bending over with pain, his courage quailed. He asked me if I meant to persist in my resistance. I told him I did, come what might, that he may be used to me like a brute for he may have used me like a brute for 6 months, and that I was determined to be used no longer. With that, he strove to drag me to a stick that was lying just out of the stable door. He meant to knock me down, but just as he was leaning over to get the stick, I seized him with both hands by his collar and brought him by a sudden snatch to the ground. By this time, Bill came. Covey called upon him for assistance. Bill wanted to know what he could do. Covey said, "Take hold of him, take hold of him." Billy said his master hired him out to work and not to help whip me, so he left Covey and myself to fight our own battle out. We were at it for nearly 2 hours. A 2-hour fight. That's a really long fight. Covey at length let me go, puffing and blowing at a great rate, saying that if I had not resisted, he would not have whipped me half so much. The truth was that he had not whipped me at all. I considered him as getting entirely the worst end of the bargain, for he had drawn no blood from me, but I from him had. The whole 6 months afterward that I spent with Mr. Covey, he never laid the weight of his finger upon me in anger. He would occasionally say he didn't want to get hold of me again. No, thought I, you need not, for you will come off worse than you did before. This battle with Mr. Covey was the turning point in my career as a slave. It rekindled the few expiring embers of freedom and revived within me a sense of my own manhood. It recalled the departed self-confidence and inspired me again with the determination to be free. The gratification afforded by the triumph was a full compensation for whatever else might follow, even death itself. He only can understand the deep satisfaction which I experienced, who has himself repelled by force the bloody arm of slavery. I felt as I never felt before. It was a glorious resurrection from the tomb of slavery to the heaven of freedom. My long-crushed spirit rose, cowardice departed, bold defiance took its place, and now resolved that, however long I might remain a slave in form, the day had passed forever when I could be a slave in fact. I did not hesitate to let it be known to me that the white man who expected to succeed in whipping must also succeed in killing me. So Frederick Douglass says, if I get whipped, they better kill me, because if not, I'm going to fight back and resist and kill them. So this is a turning point for him. That's where I'm going to pause. We're going to call that the end of part 1 of chapter 10.